I wanted to give a few talks here about how you avoid disappointment on the spiritual path. And I do it for a couple of reasons. First of all, as I've explained, I found my first spiritual movement when I was 18. It was a meditation movement. After a few years, I left it. And I had some years where I was really hugely disappointed with that movement and with the guru. And in a sense also disappointed with the spiritual path, even though I had a limited understanding of it back then. But I'm not really sure that I would have completely left the spiritual path behind. I would have completely given up on it. But when I think back, I can see that if I had given up on the spiritual path because of that disappointment, my life would have been so different that it's hard to even imagine. I mean, my life is so much richer, so much more fulfilling today because I have kept going on the spiritual path and kept going until I broke through. And I've had, positive experiences from the beginning, but they have just become better and better. And today it's just a huge adventure to be on the spiritual path. It's just made my life so much more exciting. And naturally, I hope other people can avoid having some disappointment with the spiritual path, cause them to give up on the spiritual path. Because I have seen people over the years, the decades I've been on the spiritual path, I've seen people who either completely gave up on the spiritual path or became very disappointed, and it gave them various problems. So I'm going to give a few talks, I don't know how many, we'll see how it unfolds, about how to avoid disappointment. And in this one, I'm going to focus a little bit more on some general things of how you approach the path, because it's become clear to me as I was thinking about this that we are actually, when we've grown up in a modern society, we are set up to fail on the spiritual path. We are set up to be disappointed with the spiritual path. And the reason for this is that, as I've said before, we grow up in a society that it's anti-spiritual, because it tells us nothing about a path. There's religion, which tells us about salvation, but it's always something that happens outside ourselves. And there's materialism, which denies that there's any kind of spiritual path. But the other big problem in modern society is that we're not taught anything about psychology, about human psychology. And so, when we find the spiritual path, we tend to have this outer view, this outer expectation of what the path is all about. And it's invariably going to lead to disappointment, because when it comes right down to it, as I've tried to explain in many of my videos, the essence of the spiritual path is resolving your psychology. What keeps you out of heaven or the spiritual realm or the ascension or whatever you call it, enlightenment, whatever you call it, is unresolved psychology. And the core of spiritual growth is to resolve that psychology. Then you will naturally raise your consciousness. You will naturally go into a higher state of consciousness when you remove what's pulling you away from it. But see, we're not taught that as we grow up. And there are some spiritual movements that don't teach that either, at least not as directly as I'm saying it here. And so this is why I'm saying, we are actually set up with disappointment, because we find the spiritual path because we're dissatisfied with traditional religion, we're dissatisfied with materialism, we feel there has to be more to understand about life. And so when we find a spiritual teaching or guru or movement, we tend to think, well, this is it, now I found it. And you tend to think that the way this movement defines the path or describes the path, that's the ultimate understanding. And in my experience, both my own experience, but also watching, thousands of people, very, very few spiritual seekers end up following their first spiritual movement for the rest of their lives. And certainly very, very few can make progress by studying just one spiritual teaching. You need to find more than one. And what does that mean? That means that in many cases, people have to go through this disappointment with their first spiritual movement. It's like after some time, you have the honeymoon period where everything seems wonderful. After some time, you have questions, you have observations, there's a certain tension that starts building up. And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with coming to recognize that your first spiritual movement wasn't what you thought it was, and you need to leave. Often people feel we need to leave, and there's nothing in between. And a typical scenario that I saw in myself and many other people is that we need to leave our first spiritual movement without having anything to replace it. So many people go into sort of a vacuum. I felt I was in a vacuum for several years. I had no other spiritual teaching. I was reading a few books here and there, but I really didn't have anything to replace it. It was almost like I needed to, even though I wasn't consciously aware of this, I needed to process the experience before I was ready for something else. So we have this period there where we can feel very disappointed, and we can go into a negative reaction, and for example, blaming the teacher or blaming other people or this or that. So how do we avoid this? Well, I'll probably talk more later about this when you are being disappointed by a spiritual movement. But for now, I want to focus on some general things. Here we are, we've grown up in these modern societies, we've been affected by traditional religion, some kind of materialism, and now we find a spiritual movement that talks about a spiritual path. So how do we deal with this? And there are certain people I have met who, when they find a spiritual teaching, they're afraid of everything. They're really, really fear-based. And I found some, for example, that grew up in Jehovah's Witnesses, in fundamentalist Christianity, or some other religions that were very much based on this fear of going to hell, fear of making a mistake, fear of following a false teacher. And I certainly, when I was younger, I had this fear of following a false teacher, but it didn't stop me from experimenting. And there are some people I have met that are so in fear, you can't help them. You just can't talk to them. You really cannot get anywhere because they're so afraid of being wrong that they don't dare to experiment. And most people don't even dare to open themselves to a spiritual teaching, but there are some that do. And then they end up, after a while, they end up finding something, and sometimes it can be, they see what seems to be a contradiction in the teaching. Or the guru does something that they think he shouldn't have done. And it's like, there's this little thing that happens, and then their minds switch, and now they go totally into fear and panic. And they think the guru is a false guru, he was out to blame them or to fool them, and all these kind of things. It can also be that they enter a movement, an organization, and they're disappointed by how people treat them. That's also a common scenario. And there's no way to really help people like this other than say, you've got to be willing to experiment. Because look at how we grew up. No teaching about a spiritual path. And what do we know about selecting a spiritual path or a spiritual guru? So we find something and we go into it, and as I've said in some other videos, the reason we go into our first spiritual movement is that we feel this is something we need to go into. But our outer minds then superimpose that this has to be true, because we are so afraid of following a false teacher, it has to be a true teacher. And then when we come to doubt that we go into this, or people go into this fear-based reaction. And you just have to step back and say, that's actually not really what's happening. What's happening is, I needed to have that experience. It was specified in my life plan that I had that experience. And it's part of my helping other people from a similar background than me being ready to follow the spiritual path. I am one of the pioneers from my background, whether you came from fundamentalist Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses, or a completely scientific materialist background. You are one of the pioneers, and it was your role to experiment. And in order to experiment, you had to go into that movement, you had to come to doubt it, and then you have to deal with the fear in yourself, and you have to move on. So that when you talk to other people who are coming from a similar background, you can say, yeah, I know what you're going through, but this is what helped me. So you have to find a way, whatever it is for you individually. And I know that there's some people that won't be open to anything, but I will say that, as I've explained in some other videos, there's an enormous momentum. There's an enormous force on earth that want to prevent us from walking the spiritual path. And getting us to go into fear is just one of the things they do. And so I have teachings from the Ascended Masters. I have tools from the Ascended Masters. You can go on this website I have, transcendencetoolbox.com, transcendencetoolbox.com, and you can find some invocations and decrees to Archangel Michael that can really protect your energy field from these projections about you having made a mistake and just the fear. Because you need to reduce the fear in your emotional body before you can start thinking more rationally about this and say, maybe I don't have to react the way I reacted. Maybe I can find a more mature reaction. So this was one thing about fear, people who are trapped in fear. So now there's another thing that can lead to disappointment on the spiritual path, and it's probably, in the modern world, it's probably the biggest source of disappointment on the spiritual path. And I'll tell you what it is. So what's your reaction here? How many seconds did it take before you started thinking, is he going to say anything? What's he going to tell me? When is he going to give it to me? And what I'm pointing out here is that one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest sources of disappointment is impatience. And there is, of course, this very short-term impatience that I was talking about now, which is, our minds have become so addicted to stimulation. Something has to happen all the time. And this has become worse and worse and worse, especially with these little computers we have in our pockets, that we're always connected. And there's always stimulation to the mind. You can see it in movies, how the pace has sped up. Things need to happen all the time. There's so much action and special effects that there's no storyline anymore, no acting. And many other examples of this. So if you come to the spiritual path thinking something has to happen all the time, you are setting yourself up for disappointment, because the spiritual path is very, very different. Yes, one important element of the spiritual path is to expand your understanding of the spiritual realm and how the world really works. And that requires study. And yes, it can be very intellectually stimulating to read spiritual teachings, whether it's books or whatever, or you can listen to spiritual teachers or whatever. It can be very stimulating. But what most people find is that, there comes a point when you find a spiritual teaching where you have gotten a basic grasp of what the teaching is about. And once you have that, a basic understanding, intellectual understanding of what the path is about, it's almost like you don't need more intellectual understanding. You need to apply that understanding. You need to put it into practice. And that means you go into a phase where now it's not a matter of getting this new knowledge all the time and constantly having your mind stimulated by more and more advanced teachings. Now, in order to get somewhere, to really shift your consciousness, you have to put it into practice. And that requires time. It will take time. I mean, I once saw this comic strip where you have two monks in their robes sitting cross-legged in a bare room. And the older one says to the younger monk, no, nothing happens next. This is it. And of course you can see this. This is a Westerner who's just come in to this Tibetan monastery or wherever it is, where they sit. They don't even really meditate, they just sit. And so he is, of course, they have sat for 30 seconds and he's asking, what happens next? Because he is so used to something has to happen all the time. And you will see some spiritual teachers out there who will address this, that their students just want stimulation all the time. They always want something new to be happening. And it can literally become an addiction. I have met people who are constantly looking for these peak experiences. It has to be higher and higher experiences. But you see, on the spiritual path, the real goal is not to have an experience that feels higher than your normal state of consciousness. Because what does it take to have a peak experience? There has to be contrast. Contrast between your normal state of awareness and the experience you're getting. But what's the goal of the spiritual path? It is to raise your normal level of consciousness. Which means what? There will be less and less contrast between the peak experience and your normal state of consciousness, because the real goal of the spiritual path is to come to a point where your normal level of consciousness is at the level you glimpsed in the peak experience. But see, as you go through that process, it's not that you become deliriously happy or always in the spiritual state of mind. It actually becomes normal. It becomes a new normal to be in this higher state of mind. And it isn't as dramatic. In fact, it becomes less and less dramatic as you walk the spiritual path. But you become also much more peaceful, much more balanced, much more in equanimity, not swinging from high and low. You might say that, when we are addicted to this stimulation, it's like there always has to be something that's more, that's better than it was before. You are on this constant, chasing the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And as you get further and further on the spiritual path, this disappears, because now you are in this constant state of peace. So if you are always looking for this stimulation, you won't go beyond a certain level on the spiritual path, and you will end up being disappointed, because there's no teaching that can continue to give these shocking new revelations or these higher and higher experiences. It just can't be done. I mean, it's just, what the mind wants is, it's a never-ending process. Right? It just keeps going. But the spiritual path is actually about shifting your normal sense of awareness to a higher level on a permanent basis. So this is why there comes a point on the spiritual path where you have to start taking the long view. And you have to say that the goal of the spiritual path is actually ongoing progress, ongoing growth. And this is another aspect of impatience, where it's very, very common that people come to the spiritual path. And then a spiritual movement or guru defines there's this goal. It can be cosmic consciousness, enlightenment, awakening, whatever it is. And then they're saying, in typical Western way, okay, when is it going to happen? How long is it going to take me? Tell me, what steps do I have to go through, and how long is it going to take me to reach that? And as I've said before, in my first meditation movement, in the early days of the movement, people were told that if they meditated 20 minutes morning and evening, they would reach cosmic consciousness in 8 years. Guaranteed. So 8 years goes by. There are some people who have meditated every day for those 8 years, and they start saying, well, listen, you told us this was going to happen, and it hasn't happened. What went wrong here? And what went wrong was they were given an unrealistic expectation, but they also accepted that. And so what I'm saying is, this is a misunderstanding, and this is, again, our modern society sets us up with this, define a goal and define the steps to get me there, so I can see how long it's going to take me. But you can't do that. You cannot set up a guaranteed path, because the spiritual path requires all these shifts in awareness. You are going to have to shift your awareness. Nobody can do it for you. It's going to have to happen from within. And that requires, as I said in the beginning, the resolution of psychology. It's not going to happen just by doing the outer practice. So the question is, how long is it going to take you? Depends on how willing you are to look at your own psychology, to wrestle with it. How long is that going to take? It's really up to you to decide. So what I'm saying is there comes that point where if you want to avoid disappointment, you have to have this longer time horizon. And it was a little easier for me because at a very early stage on my path, I found the teachings of the Ascended Masters. And they are focusing on the ascension. And the way it was presented is that if you follow the teachings, apply the teachings, you can ascend after the end of your natural lifetime. And I found this in my 20s, so I looked ahead and I thought, yeah, that's a while out there. So I wasn't really so focused on this because my ultimate goal was the ascension, and that was, years in advance. But there came a point also where I started realizing, no, an important aspect of the spiritual path is your growth in consciousness. And that's when I started focusing on that. I went into therapy, I did all kinds of things, to resolve psychology, and I've been doing that ever since. But that process I saw as something that will be ongoing for the rest of my lifetime, for the rest of the time I'm in embodiment. I'm, of course, planning to ascend after this lifetime, but until then I will keep working on resolving psychology. And when I look back at my spiritual path, what has given me the immediate effect, the immediate sense that I have accomplished something, is the resolution of psychology, which has helped me overcome a lot of these reactionary patterns, helped me feel more at peace with myself, with being on this planet, which is a very difficult planet to be on. And so this has been the immediate reward. It's like instead of having this goal way out there, I've had this immediate goal, but this has been fulfilled all along. Not that I have feel that I have resolved all psychology, but I have resolved more and more, and I feel much more at peace, much more balanced, much more in a state of equilibrium about being on Earth. And that has been the immediate reward. And I think if you want to avoid disappointment, you need to shift into that and realize this is an ongoing process. It won't end as long as you're in embodiment, but it will get better and better and better. You will become more and more peaceful, more and more open to expressing yourself, less and less concerned with other people's reactions, and all these kind of things that are burdening you now will fade away if you look at psychology. So impatience, it in a sense has another aspect, but we can also treat it as a separate aspect. And since 2002, I have been in the position of putting on conferences, publishing books and websites about spiritual things, and interacting with a lot of people that I've given advice to. And one of the things I've observed over time is that there are some people that will come, and often they're not new to the spiritual path, they've always been in another spiritual teaching, but they have questions. And so they're asking you a question. You're standing there next to them, face to face to them, and they're asking you a question. And you start answering. You start answering their question because you're thinking, in the beginning, when I was new to this, I was thinking, they want an answer to that specific question. But then you notice that as soon as you have finished answering, they ask another question. And then after a while, you start looking at them while you're answering the question. And you can see they're not listening to you at all. It just goes in one ear, out the other. Because they're already thinking about, when is he going to take a breath so I can ask the next question? And, after a while, I came to this point where I would stop asking these people's questions, answering their questions, because I realized it led nowhere. I mean, they would just keep asking, and they could have 10, 15 questions, as long as you were willing to stand there, because they didn't really want answers to their questions. They somehow wanted attention, and I found that there was a better way to give them attention than answering questions. And so, but even that, you can't fill that need. So what I want to say about this is that I realized that this is again due to our faulty upbringing in terms of human psychology. Because, what we should have been told when we were in kindergarten is that the human mind has a certain way of functioning. And it's very simple. It can go in both directions. In other words, you can direct your attention outwards, or you can direct your attention inwards. So it can go in both directions, but it cannot go in both directions at the same time. In other words, if you are projecting out, thinking about asking the next question, you cannot listen to the answer for your first question. And I met so many people on the spiritual path who are in this state. It's almost like they go to a spiritual teacher. They spend the time, and they are sitting there in front of that spiritual teacher and listening to the teacher, or they are reading a book, but they're not listening. They're not taking in. It's all projecting out. They have questions, they have a certain viewpoint they want validated. They want validated that they are important and special people. They want attention. They're always looking for something. But their attention is always going out. And they never stop to look within and say, do I need to look at myself? Do I need to look at my own reactions? Do I need to realize that I have a reactionary pattern that the guru is talking about, and this is what will help me, not out there. It is actually not going to help you to focus your attention outside yourself. As I said, ultimately the progress on the spiritual path comes down to resolving psychology. You cannot resolve psychology without looking in. You can't do it by looking out. You can see, and I have seen people who have a degree as a psychologist, and they have worked for years helping other people in therapy. But they themselves have certain psychological issues they haven't resolved. In fact, there was kind of a joke that I heard many years ago that people who go to the university to study psychology is because they hope to resolve something in their own psychology. But then one day they stand there, now they have a degree and a student loan, so now they have to go out and practice trying to help other people even though they haven't helped themselves. And it was kind of a standing joke. I don't know how accurate it is. But anyway, I definitely see many people who are just always looking out. They think somehow the resolution to their psychological issues is out there. You need to find some kind of knowledge that will resolve it. Knowledge might help you resolve it, but nothing is going to be resolved until you reverse the direction of your attention and look in. And look at what is it in myself. And so what I'm saying is here, if you have been disappointed, if you feel like you haven't gotten the results, ask yourself this simple question. Have I been listening? Have I made space in my mind to actually take in that teaching and look at what does it mean for me personally? It's not a matter of having this fantastic intellectual knowledge out there. I met people on the spiritual path they have studied spiritual teachings for decades, and they could recite all these teachings. But it was all in the intellectual level. They hadn't connected. What does that particular teaching mean for me? And how can it help me change something in myself? It's all out there. The next thing. What does that mean? And many of these people, they can see in other people, they can see other people's psychology and what needs to be changed there. But you see, as I've said before, changing another person's psychology is not going to help you make progress on your personal path. The only thing that will help you is to change your psychology. Resolve something in your psychology. This requires you to listen to the teaching, take it in, and look at how does it apply to me. Not all of these other people. That doesn't matter. It's going to help you. And so this kind of leads to the next topic here, which is shifting from what I've called the outer path to the inner path. And I have a breakthrough video where I talk about this. I talk about it in other videos too. It's like I said, a lot of people are focused on the outer teaching or the outer spiritual practice. And they are thinking this is going to do it for them. Like I said, in my first spiritual movement, people have been promised, you don't need to look at your psychology, just meditate. And it will automatically be resolved and you'll be in cosmic consciousness. Not the way it works. Never going to happen. There is no spiritual practice that is going to resolve your psychology for you. Because your psychology, as I've explained in several videos, you have these subconscious selves, and they are based on a certain illusion. And the only thing that is going to set you free from that self is that you come to consciously see that illusion. You don't necessarily need to see how the actual situation was in a past life where you took on that illusion, but you need to see the illusion and need to consciously let it go. And that is what I call the inner path of looking at yourself. And I have met countless people, I mean literally thousands of people who haven't grasped this one thing. They're still looking for something out there that's going to do it for them. Whether it's a guru, whether it's a practice, whether it's a spiritual teaching. Some people go into therapy thinking that is going to do it for them. Nothing is going to do it for you. The spiritual path is a do-it-yourself process. You are going to have to look at yourself. You are going to have to look at what your ego and these subconscious selves don't want you to look at. And they are going to scream bloody murder. He's wrong. He's wrong. There is a way to make spiritual progress without looking at us. Don't look at us. You don't need to look at us. Just leave us alone here so we can continue to suck your energy. We want to survive. Don't look at us. You just focus on the outer practice. Focus on the outer teaching. Don't listen to this guy. Go find yourself the real guru who can do it for you. All of this stuff. It's all nonsense. Okay? And I will guarantee you it will lead you to disappointment. And I have seen so many people. You can go on for years. Some people can go on for decades. There comes that point where suddenly you realize, I'm not getting anywhere. Well, some people may never realize it, but many people do, and so comes disappointment, because now you don't know what to do. Okay, so stepping back, looking at another aspect of what leads to disappointment. And it's not making a commitment. I see many people, and this is again because of our upbringing in these modern societies. We kind of think that the spiritual path, it's just something we're going through. It's like we go to school, we go to get an education, and we get a job. We're kind of just, we're kind of halfway cheating our way through, taking it easy, not really committing to anything. And so people find the spiritual path, and for many people it becomes almost a source of entertainment. I call it granola bar spirituality, because they read a book, they go to some kind of course or a weekend workshop, but it's just like eating a granola bar. You're a little bit hungry, but you're not ready for a big meal. So you just eat a granola bar and it ties you over. And that's how they do with spirituality, They're living their normal lives, and spirituality is kind of like a hobby. It's something a little bit stimulating you do once in a while. And that is going to lead you to disappointment. It's not going to give you results. The spiritual path is really it's such a different process than what we were brought up to think life is about, that it requires commitment. It requires that you see that the spiritual path is not a hobby. It's not an interest. You could call it a lifestyle, but still it's not something you take on. It becomes this the purpose for your life, the background for your life. And I've seen many people who didn't approach it that way. As I said, they took it as it was some kind of interest in life, like so many others. You study to learn some kind of hobby or some kind of sport or whatever, but you're not really committed to it. It's just something you do when you have time. But but in order to really get results, you have to commit. But this, of course, saying this leads to the other thing that leads to disappointment is overcommitment. Because I've seen many people on the spiritual path, and I did it myself with my first spiritual movement. You are willing to shift your lifestyle. You are willing to completely change your focus on life. Your entire priorities shift so that it's the spiritual path and the spiritual growth that is the most important for you. And so I've seen many people who made this commitment. They might give up on an education. Some people even leave families or spouses or whatever, and now they want to live an entirely spiritual lifestyle. So they might come and work for a spiritual movement. They might take all of these classes. I saw people in the meditation movement. They would work on staffs to keep these classes going, and then would work up course credit. And then when they had enough course credit, they would take a course, and then they'd go back and work again. So, I've seen people who broke off their lifestyle, traveled to some ashram somewhere in India or somewhere else, and they lived there and they worked there, and so you see, since the 1960s, you see so many people who have been willing to make the commitment. And many of these people have become disappointed after some time. It's what I call the crash and burn syndrome. It's like they shift everything in their lives and they say, now I'm only going to focus on the spiritual growth. And then they do everything that their guru or organization tells them to do. And they are very, very eager. They practice hours a day, meditation, decrees, chanting, prostrations, whatever it is. But they are doing it with this expectation that I talked about. You have a specific result that you want to achieve, and you want to achieve it as quickly as possible. And there comes a point where the strain of what they're doing just becomes so much that they snap. They can't do it anymore. And then they become very disappointed. And often that disappointment is directed at the guru because they feel that the guru made them a promise. And in many cases, gurus do make these kind of promises. Like I said in my meditation movement there, the guru did promise people, meditate twice a day for 8 years, you will be in cosmic consciousness. It was the kind of promise that no guru should make. But there are other variations of that promise out there in other spiritual movements. And so many people have bought into this, and they have adopted a very extreme lifestyle, very austere, very, very focused lifestyle. And after a while, the strain just becomes too much and they can't handle it anymore, and something breaks and they have to give it up. And now they may direct the anger at the guru or the organization or other people in the organization, but really they're angry with themselves. They're disappointed with themselves because they're thinking, oh, I wasn't good enough. I couldn't really hack it. It was something with me. Because many spiritual movements, they will have this underlying thing in their culture, The guru is enlightened, so there can't be anything wrong with him and his instructions. And we have this spiritual technique that is just the highest spiritual technique. So there can't be anything wrong with that. And we have this organization that's directed by the guru, so there can't be anything wrong with the organization. And what does that leave? If your expectations weren't fulfilled, where is there something wrong? It can only be with you, right? How people go into this, they might directing blame out, but they're really blaming themselves. I wasn't good enough. And what I'm saying is, this is again one of these expectations from our modern society that sets us up to fail. And when you realize that, you can just trash it. You can just let it go and say, not buying into this. I have a breakthrough video I did recently about how you can't go wrong on the spiritual path. So if you have been into this, what I just described, watch that video, because there was a reason why you did what you did. And it was something you had to do, but why did you have to do it? That's what you need to ask yourself. And you needed to do it in order to find balance. You see, the most important ability or state of mind to develop on the spiritual path is balance. And I've seen so many people over the years, and I've done it myself for many years, who gravitate towards an extreme. We think, and I did it myself, I changed my whole lifestyle. I went from Denmark to America to be part of a spiritual movement, and it just, it became all-consuming. And there came a point where I just started seeing it. I started seeing how unbalanced it was. And then I started realizing that what the Buddha talked about 2,500 years ago was the middle way. And I realized it wasn't the midpoint between two extremes. It was actually stepping away from the extremes. So you're not affected by the extremes. You're not pulled towards the extremes. So one extreme is the normal materialistic lifestyle that we live in modern societies. The other extreme is this total commitment to some almost monastic lifestyle, extreme spiritual lifestyle. And I realized I needed to find some kind of balance there, my own personal balance between these two. And it was a struggle. I mean, it took years for me to some would say I still haven't achieved it, but I certainly have achieved more balanced state of mind. And you can too. I mean, you can do the same. And you can say, okay, if I went through this extreme, it was just because it was in my life plan that I wanted to find balance. And in order to find that balance, I had to force myself to deal with this issue in my psychology that causes me to be unbalanced. And that's why I had to act it out until I could see how unbalanced it was. And if you can do that, if you can make that switch, you can overcome the disappointment. You can realize, well, I did what I had to do, but now I see why I had to do it. So now I move on. I move on to a higher level, a more balanced approach to the spiritual path. Doesn't mean you abandon the path. It just means you take a more balanced approach to it, where you, again, as I said, it's not about the outer path. It's not about doing the outer things. It's about looking at your psychology and resolving psychology. And look at the times you're living in. I mean, there has never been so much awareness about psychology in the world. There's never been so many opportunities for resolving psychology, whether it's various forms of therapy, various spiritual teachings, that even the teachings that I have received from the Ascended Masters, and I've talked about in my other videos, there are so many opportunities there to resolve psychology, come to see these subconscious selves. I mean, what is it that pulls people into a materialistic lifestyle? It's certain subconscious selves they have. What is it that pulled some of us, many of us, to go into this extreme spiritual lifestyle? It's other selves we have. And when we come to look at both of them and let them go, then we really make progress on the spiritual path. And as I said, you can have outer goals. You can have outer goals, and you are thinking, I have to achieve this. I have to achieve cosmic consciousness, or personal Christhood, or this or that. But you have an outer image of what that means. But the real goal of the spiritual path is the shift in awareness where, oh, you are at peace now. It's not a matter of achieving this glorious state that you saw up there. It's a matter of achieving this inner balance, this inner peace. That's what it's about. And you can never be disappointed when you realize that. Because when you experience more peace of mind, this is a reward in itself. You're feeling better. You are experiencing that you are better. It's not a matter of chasing this mental image out there. It's an actual experience. You've shifted your state of consciousness and you are more at peace with being who you are. There's no room for disappointment there. So look at it this way. The most important thing you can realize about the spiritual path is that it has these stages. And what does that mean? It means when you first find the spiritual path, you're at a certain stage. And at that stage, you cannot see what the spiritual path really is about. I'm not blaming anybody, okay? I can look back at myself when I was young. I was totally enthusiastic about this. And I thought I understood what the spiritual path was about. But I didn't, because I couldn't see that far ahead. I couldn't see that far above my level of consciousness. So, if you want to avoid disappointment, at least with the outer mind, realize that when you found the spiritual path, you could only see so many steps ahead. But as you walk further and further on the spiritual path, you have to be willing to consciously shift the way you look at the path. And that means that when you are new to the path, you probably defined some kind of end goal of the path. And you have been thinking ever since that you have been working your way towards that end goal, however you defined it. What I'm saying is, the way you could define it in the beginning was limited by the level of consciousness you had, even by the spiritual teaching you found, because that also somewhat corresponded to your level of consciousness. So there comes a point where you need to consciously challenge or question that end goal and say, is that really what the spiritual path is about? Can I find a higher approach, a more balanced approach? And if you're willing to do that, you will transcend that level where you can be disappointed. Because, as I said, your goal will not be to achieve this far-flung image up there that you have where you have a mental image of what a higher state of consciousness means. You are already experiencing that there has been growth, and you realize that this growth can continue towards higher levels. And there's no point in formulating a mental image about what it is, because it's really all about looking at your psychology, overcoming these subconscious selves, and you will experience the higher state of consciousness. And if you make that shift, where instead of focusing on a particular goal that's out there that you can define with a linear mind, you're focusing on resolving psychology, resolving what takes away your state of balance, then you will experience more and more balance, more and more peace of mind. And you get on a path there's no possibility of disappointment, there's no possibility of defeat, there's no possibility you could make a mistake, because you are experiencing more peace of mind than you had before. How could that be disappointing? It's a constant, ongoing process of going towards greater and greater sense of fulfillment, because you have that peace, you have that equanimity, you have that balance. Balanced state of mind. So if I had known this 40 years ago, things would have been easier for me. But the thing is, if you tried to tell me this 40 years ago, I wouldn't have been ready for it. I couldn't have taken it in. I couldn't have grasped it. So that's why I'm saying, when you accept that the spiritual path are stages, you don't need to look back at your life and say, oh, I was so naive. Why didn't I realize this? I should have known it. You couldn't have known it. Okay? Your path was exactly the way it needed to be for you to go through what you needed to go through in your psychology. So just, step back, be willing to look within if you haven't done it before, and say, okay, why did I react the way I did? Even if you got disappointed, why did I get disappointed? What was it in me that I need to see that caused that sense of disappointment? And then look at it and see that it's just a separate self, because the separate self is projecting there's a problem you have to solve. For example, you have to attain cosmic consciousness. And there's another self-respect, and you have to do it this way, by looking out there. And it's not a matter of solving the problem. It's a matter of looking at the self, looking at it's based on an illusion, and just say, I'm not trying to solve this problem here. I'm just letting the self die. That's when you achieve balance. That's when you achieve peace of mind. Every time you let go of one of these selves, and quite frankly, I can tell you from experience, we've got a lot of these. And we all do. It's not a matter of saying some people don't, because that's just naive. They're just not looking at themselves. They haven't looked deeply enough. And I've known people who are at that surface level. They're not willing to look within, and they will insist that you don't have to look within, and they will say, oh, I've achieved this peace of mind or this, but it's not. It's just an outer appearance they're taking on, because the only way to achieve balance is through resolution of psychology, which means resolution, letting these cells die. There's no other way. You can't fake it. You can't cheat your way to it. And if you can grasp that, you are instantly pulling yourself above the possibility of failure and disappointment. And I hope you can achieve that, because it's a good place to be.